Hello, long time no see. Welcome to the Catella Bubble, where I, Catella, an anti-royal commentator, tackle the British royal family tea in a way that addresses the big elephant in the room. These royal buffoons are in the British government and have an inordinate. That's such a hard word. What's another word for inordinate? Inordinate synonym. Unwarranted, that's a good word. These royal buffoons are in the British government and have an unwarranted amount of power and influence in the world. And I would like to see that change. Thank you very much. So where have I been the last couple of months? First, I was gone for a long time on holiday. I went to Italy for some fun in the sun, and then we went to the UK to visit my fiance's family and friends in jolly old England. And then when I got back for the summer, I was starting a brand new job, so it's just been really hectic, you know. But if you are a Catella Bubble superfan, you will know that I have not disappeared off of the internet, which you would know because you are following me on TikTok at Catella Bubble. If you haven't followed me there already, go follow me there. And while you're out there supporting the channel, why not just click this subscribe button as well? That would be really nice. Click subscribe, click like, add a comment. Do the stuff that boosts the algorithm, all right? It would make me very happy. I have so many scripts that I've been working on the past couple of months, but the projects I was looking to do as my debut back to the main channel are just way too big of time commitments right now for me personally. So in order to get back to posting more regularly without drowning in editing, I want to try to do some more commentary videos that are a little bit more chill and, more importantly, shorter. I know that there is so much royal family news that has come and gone. I also know that the new season of The Crown is out, but I haven't started it yet, so no spoilers. From what I've heard though, it isn't very good. The two stories I want to talk about today are like the bread and butter of my channel. Number one, neocolonialism. And number two, the monarchy's actual function in British politics and why it needs to be done away with. So let's start off with the most depressing topic first, neocolonialism. King Charles's trip to Kenya. In November of 2023, while I was on my extended hiatus, Charles and Camilla took a trip to Kenya. Now, this state visit had a lot of moving parts to it. The trip overall ended up being kind of a if not an outright flop. I think it showed the complete incompatibility between the pro-monarchist viewpoint, the liberal to left-wing viewpoint, not even anti-monarchist necessarily, but just like slightly liberal, and the Crown's PR strategies. What followed was kind of a trip that was destined to be unsatisfying for all. First, let's think about what a typical pro-monarchist conservative might have wanted out of this trip. Kenya as a royal tour destination was meant to harken back to 1952, when then Princess Elizabeth learned of her father's death and her ascent to the throne while on tour there. The choice of Kenya is also an obvious callback to colonialism, a time in which the British controlled this area as subjects of the crown. For conservatives, this trip could symbolize that the sun never sets on the British Empire, so that they could still cling on to the delusion that Britain is a global superpower who has dominion over other nations, in particular people of color. Even if this typical pro-monarchy group isn't explicitly calling for racist policies or glorifying previous abuse of POC, the Crown and the British government as a whole, have not done a great job of, not appealing to these covert biases and pseudo-patriotic narratives. Just wait until the next session where we get on to talking about Suella Braverman. Holy crap. Now let's take a look at what a typical anti-monarchist or monarchy ambivalent liberal would want out of this trip, with the obvious elephant in the room being the royal family's participation in the Atlantic slave trade, from which much of their wealth was accumulated, to colonialism enacted by the British in the name of His or Her Majesty's government. It was pretty much a given that any sensible person would call for the king to apologize for these historical atrocities. But even if that apology were given, and we'll get to that in a moment, it was clear that the general optics of this trip would simply never play to a progressive audience. Anytime you're going to have the royal family in photo ops surrounded by people of color, the historical baggage is so obvious, regardless of how nice or apologetic they might seem. This meant that King Charles was not going to get out of having to address these obvious political implications of his state visit. So how did it go? And what was the apologist's defense of this trip? I just want to give my perspective on King Charles's speech before we delve into any of the commentary or apologists talking about this speech. Let's see if we can give credit where credit is due.
Mabibi na mabwana hamjambo niaje yangu kuwa nanyi jioni ya leo.
Can someone let me know if any of that pronunciation was accurate? It sounds like he learned how to read that phonetically. Anyway, let's move on.
I cannot tell you what a great pleasure it is for my wife and I to be back in Kenya once again. If I may say so, it is particularly special to be able to return to this extraordinary country in the 60th year of your independence. Today, Mr. President, you and I stood by the mighty Mugumo tree, which marks the spot where almost 60 years ago the Kenyan flag was first raised.
One thing that strikes me as interesting is that the language he uses is very impersonal. Kenya gained independence 60 years ago, but there's no actual acknowledgement of how that independence was won. Already, we're not acknowledging any of the atrocities committed by the British during the fights for independence of Kenya. We're getting the sense that King Charles is not going to be giving an apology, but rather is more so here to try to celebrate Kenyan independence, but you cannot separate the independence of Kenya from the atrocities of the British government.
It means a great deal to my wife and myself that in our coronation year, our first state visit to a Commonwealth country should bring us here to Kenya. We both take considerable pride in renewing the ties between the United Kingdom and Kenya, a country that has long held such special meaning for my family.
I also find it's an odd choice to emphasize the royal family's connections to Kenya as opposed to focusing on Kenya as a nation unto itself. It almost makes it sound like King Charles's choice to go to Kenya is only for these personal connections, for the connections to Queen Elizabeth, rather than choosing to go to Kenya to forge a bond with an acknowledgement of these past atrocities.
Now, it is well known, I think, that my dear mother, the late Queen, had a particular affection for Kenya and the Kenyan people. She arrived here in 1952 a princess, but left as Queen. It is extremely moving to read her diary from that visit, in which she wrote that she did not want to miss a moment of Kenya's extraordinary landscapes. I really cannot thank you enough for the support Kenya gave her through that difficult time.
No mention from that entry about anything related to the Kenyan people. Oftentimes it seems like a traditional narrative is to praise Africa for its landscapes, for its nature. And it's not to say that those things aren't worthy of being praised, but it also shows that the royal family does not actually focus on the people within Kenya and how to do right by those people. It also seems very selfish to point to the idea of the poetic nature of going to Kenya because of its connection to Queen Elizabeth's ascent to the throne. It makes it sound like this trip is purely for the PR of the family, to have this sort of poetic resonance for the royal family's own narrative, as opposed to wanting to go to Kenya to directly affect its people and to make a promise to its people to do better in the future. I'm fine that Queen Elizabeth and King Charles are saying that they love Kenya for its beautiful landscape and for its connection to their family, but it's really lacking in an acknowledgement of the human cost of colonialism.
10 years later, my father, the late Duke of Edinburgh, attended the celebrations of Kenya's independence. To mark the occasion, Her late Majesty wrote to President Jomo Kenyatta to convey her sincere hope that with God's guidance, Kenya would prosper and that her people would have peace and contentment in full measure.
It seems like a nice sentiment, but when the British government hasn't actually done anything to ensure the prosperity of the Kenyan people after the atrocities of colonialism, those words ring pretty hollow.
On subsequent visits here, I was most fortunate to be able to spend some time with Kenyan conservationists, from whose profound knowledge of their environment I learned so much. Among them was the late great environmentalist and Nobel Prize winner Wangari Maathai, someone whom I greatly admired and loved. And I'm very much looking forward to spending a little time with her daughter this week and to planting a tree in her mother's memory.
This focus on Kenya's environment and nature, it's not to say that that's not a worthy cause, but I think that that's an easy cause for the royal family to take on because it doesn't actually involve human beings and actually having to reckon with any of the history and instead focus on this environmental issue rather than righting the wrongs of the past. Again, it's not to say that it's wrong to care about Kenyan conservation of wildlife, but for the average Kenyan citizen, what are they really going to take from this speech as to how the royal family and or the British government are looking to support them and care about them? Frankly, it sounds like Charles is saying that he cares more about preserving the natural landscape of Kenya than actually supporting the citizens of Kenya.
As Wangari Maathai said, when we plant trees, we plant the seeds of peace and seeds of hope. Ladies and gentlemen, my own and my family's special connections to Kenya are but one example of the myriad links between our two countries. The British people hold a deep affection for Kenya and visit in their tens and even hundreds of thousands every year.
That might be true, but how much of that is actually beneficial to the Kenyan people? I'm happy for British people to go and visit Kenya, but it cannot be ignored that a lot of those connections and Britain's willingness to visit Kenya is rooted in colonialism. I actually read a book this summer called Empire Land by Sathnam Sangera, and one of the chapters of that book was specifically looking at how British expats or British tourists interact in previous colonies of the British Empire, and some of the problematic nature with how British tourists and expats engage in other lands, and how it's not reciprocated with how they treat immigration, for example, to the United Kingdom. And so I'm reminded of that when I hear this in Charles's speech, saying, well, tons of people go and visit Kenya because of this colonial relationship or this past colonial relationship, but there's no sort of unpacking as to some of the problematic aspects of that relationship.
By the same token, I am delighted and proud that so many Kenyans choose to live, work and study in the United Kingdom. Before travelling here, my wife and I held a reception in London to celebrate the invaluable contribution of Kenyans and British Kenyans to almost every field of British life, from the arts to medicine to academia. I was as touched by their affection for the United Kingdom as I was immensely grateful for what each of them brings to my country.
I'm frustrated by this note as well. And the only time that Charles is acknowledging Kenyan people is in relation to how they have benefited the United Kingdom, rather than Kenyans working to benefit other Kenyans. It makes it sound like the contributions of Kenyan people are only to be acknowledged if it is a benefit to British people.
It is the intimacy of our shared history that has brought our people together.
Brought our people together is a weird way of phrasing it when the links between the UK and Kenya are through colonialism. The dancing around the colonialist aspect is really frustrating because as a consequence of not acknowledging the colonial aspect, it makes it sound like Charles is saying that the overall impact of colonialism was positive in bringing British people and Kenyan people together.
We must also acknowledge the most painful times of our long and complex relationship. The wrongdoings of the past are a cause of the greatest sorrow and the deepest regret. There were abhorrent and unjustifiable acts of violence committed against Kenyans as they waged, as you said at the United Nations, a painful struggle for independence and sovereignty.
This is the part of the speech that most people are sinking their teeth into. The apologists will say that Charles, by acknowledging that he has sorrow and deep regret for these atrocities, is enough, even if it is not a full-fledged apology for these atrocities. They will also say that Charles cannot apologize because it would open up the British government to questions of whether or not to give reparations to Kenya. Now, we can delve into the reparations conversation in a little bit, but one other aspect of this that really frustrates me is the use of passive language in discussing those atrocities. He says that atrocities were committed against Kenyan people, but doesn't say who committed those atrocities, namely British citizens. It dodges culpability and doesn't actually name who is responsible. So to me, it's not enough to say that there's deep sorrow and regret when Charles cannot actually name who those bad actors were. Even if he didn't want to commit to an apology, or the British government didn't want to commit to an apology, they could still have named who was responsible for these atrocities committed in their name.
And for that, there can be no excuse. In coming back to Kenya, it matters greatly to me that I should deepen my own understanding of these wrongs, and that I meet some of those whose lives and communities were so grievously affected. None of this can change the past. But by addressing our history with honesty and openness, we can perhaps demonstrate the strength of our friendship today.
What he's saying is correct, but he's not actually living by what he's actually saying. We should learn from the history, and we should acknowledge that history in order to move forward, even though we cannot change the past. And yet, he is not actually acknowledging what that history was. He's sidestepping around what has actually happened. To me, this comes across, rather than actually wanting to learn from this history, instead it presents this idea that the Kenyan people should just move on from this past because it has been acknowledged in the abstract, and begin a new friendship between the UK and Kenya. And I think that this line of thinking can become big fodder for apologists who will say, he's acknowledged that he's deeply regretful for colonialism. The government has acknowledged that this was bad and sorrowful. So why is that not enough? why is it not enough for Kenyans? Why do they need an actual apology? We can't change the past, so why not just move on into the future? But this speech and the actions of the British government aren't actually acknowledging what happened or apologizing for what happened, so there can be no movement forward. And I think it's dangerous to put that onus on Kenya now to accept this non-apology and move forward, rather than actually demanding a real apology and a real acknowledgement of these atrocities.
And in so doing, we can, I hope, continue to build an ever closer bond for the years ahead. Mr. President, in returning to Kenya, I have been struck by the many ways in which our country's relationship is now closer than ever. It is a modern partnership of equals facing today's challenges.
A modern partner of equals is, I think, a little bit misleading. There are so many reasons why the UK and Kenya would not be coming to this partnership on equal footing. Yes, Kenya is an independent nation now that can foster a relationship with the UK, who is also an independent nation. But the history of colonialism, the history of racism, the loss of life in that struggle for independence, having to rebuild after the legacy of colonialism, all of those things cannot be ignored, because all of those things show that the UK and Kenya will not be on equal footing until all of those things are openly acknowledged and openly rectified. And one way that some of those wrongs could be rectified is through reparations. But British conservatives don't want to open that can of worms, because they don't actually want to deliver what would actually have material benefits on this country that they have wronged so thoroughly in the past.
And looking to the many opportunities that together we can seize. It is fitting, then, that Kenya's first Marine Commando Unit was established earlier this year, trained by British Royal Marines. I also look forward to visiting Karioko War Grave Cemetery, where I will honor Kenyans and other Africans who died in 2 world wars. We must ensure all are granted the remembrance befitting their service.
In King Charles's role as the commander-in-chief, he of course has to mention the military heroes and the military connection. But again, it glosses over a whole history of Kenya being forced to participate in these world wars due to its colonial ties to the United Kingdom. It's great that they want to acknowledge Africans' service in these wars, but it leaves a big question mark as to why did those service members die for 2 world wars that they were not directly a part of. And the reason why is because they were fighting for British forces while under colonial rule. And so yet again, it's circling around the big elephant in the room.
Kenya's efforts to address the existential challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss are remarkable. From generating over 90% of our electricity from renewable sources, to ambitious reforestation and restoration programs, to hosting the first Africa Climate Summit here in Nairobi last month, Kenya is offering extraordinary leadership. The Nairobi Declaration brings together different peoples whose cooperation will be essential to solve some of the serious environmental and ecological challenges not only facing us in the future, but facing us here and now. And it is, if I may say so, absolutely vital that your and Africa's voice continues to be heard, including at COP28 and beyond. Because, Mr. President, there is much we could all learn from Kenya's example.
We want to hear Kenya's voice when it comes to conservation efforts, when it comes to renewable energy. We don't want to hear Kenyan voices when it comes to talking about colonialism, when it comes to demanding an apology from the British government, when it comes to demanding justice for atrocities caused to Kenyan people. Then we don't want to hear their voices. We don't actually want to listen to what they're saying and provide the proper acknowledgement of the hurt and pain that the British government has caused. The focus on Kenyan and African voices only in an environmental context, it's very low-hanging fruit. It's not to say that it's not worthy of support or worthwhile, but it ignores so many other voices that are trying to deal with the human cost and the human suffering from the hands of the British government.
So that the natural world we treasure, and which ultimately is our only sustainer, can be preserved and above all greatly enhanced and restored for the benefit of our grandchildren and the generations that follow them. Those next generations are themselves taking remarkable strides to secure their own future. I've long believed in the extraordinary potential of our young people and left my meeting with young Kenyan entrepreneurs today inspired by their accomplishments. It gives me great pride, therefore, that the Prince's Trust, which I established very nearly 50 years ago to support young people, is now operating in Kenya, and that in 2021, Ekalali Susan from Turkana County became the first Kenyan winner of the Trust's Global Award for her entrepreneurial efforts to help lift her family out of poverty.
As someone that is highly critical of capitalism, I'm also frustrated that we are perpetuating this bootstraps narrative through the Prince's Trust by celebrating only entrepreneurship, not activism, bootstraps mentality. It only helps people in power perpetuate the narrative again that if you work hard enough, if you just try hard enough and push yourself, bring yourself up by your bootstraps, then you can be successful and then you are worthy of praise. But disregards tons and tons of people living in abject poverty, struggling under this capitalist system. And a lot of that struggle comes from this colonial past that Charles refuses to acknowledge, other than in the most milquetoast terms imaginable.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, my mother, Her late Majesty, cared deeply that Kenya chose to be a member of the Commonwealth and was always grateful that Kenya has played an essential role in this family of nations to which she devoted so much of her life. On this, my first state visit to a Commonwealth country, I wish to reaffirm my own pledge to support the Commonwealth's bold vision for action and the values upon which it rests. That 1/3 of the world's population, united by peace, justice, tolerance, and mutual respect.
It's always astounding for me to be reminded that 1/3 of the global population lives in the Commonwealth. 1/3 of the population of the world cannot aspire to be the head of state of their own nation.
In this, as in so much else, Kenya is helping to shape our world and forge our future. The extraordinary ingenuity of the Kenyan people fuels these endeavors. Your environmentalists and your entrepreneurs, your religious leaders, artists, scholars, soldiers and athletes, your elders and your youth. And so, Mr. President, if I may, I would like to propose a toast to you and to the people of Kenya. It is upon the enduring connection between our people that our partnership rests. It is on their enterprise, imagination, and fortitude that our common hopes depend.
The optics not looking very great when Charles proposes a toast to Kenya and the Kenyan people. He is waited on by a Kenyan wearing a suit and white gloves. I don't know what else to say. It's optically, it's just not a great look.
Together we are stronger. Together our future is more secure. And together, as your national anthem says, may we dwell in unity, peace, and liberty. Umoja ni nguvu.
Let's read some criticism, shall we? This article is from Reuters. The headline is, King Charles regrets for colonial abuses in Kenya, not enough for some victims. Britain's King Charles and Queen Camilla began the second day of a state visit to Kenya on Wednesday as survivors of colonial-era abuses criticized his failure to issue a full apology or propose reparations. At a state dinner on Tuesday, Charles expressed his deep regret for what he called abhorrent and unjustifiable acts of violence committed against Kenyans during the country's independence struggle. President William Ruto commended the monarch's first step towards going beyond the tentative and equivocal half measures of past years, but said much remained to be done. During the 1952 to 1960 Mau Mau revolt in central Kenya, some 90,000 Kenyans were killed or maimed and 160,000 detained, the Kenyan Human Rights Commission has estimated. British colonialists also committed gross human rights violations, including land expropriation, killings, torture, and sexual violence against hundreds of thousands of people in Western Kenya over decades, UN investigators have said. Charles's visit comes at a time when former colonies are demanding that Britain do more to recognize the abuses of its colonial past. Some, notably Barbados and Jamaica, have been reevaluating their ties to the monarchy, which is also an interesting note considering that he mentions the Commonwealth at the end of this speech, but also conveniently forgets to mention that a lot of these Commonwealth nations are reconsidering that relationship. Note as well that Charles mentioned nothing about the Mau Mau revolt. He mentioned nothing about the number of Kenyans that were harmed. He mentioned nothing about getting justice for these human rights violations. His speech might sound pretty on the surface, but doesn't actually tackle any of the crucial issues that Kenyans are looking to be addressed by him and the British government. Britain agreed to a £20 million out-of-court settlement in 2013 to more than 5,200 survivors of abuses during the Mau Mau conflict, but it has refused to issue an apology and has rebuffed claims by other communities. And my pet theory is they're being cheap. They don't want to actually pay out for these atrocities committed by other communities, and it goes against all the conservative narratives about colonialism, that it was beneficial, that it brought civilization to all these uncivilized parts of the world. It goes against all of that narrative if they actually apologize and acknowledge the wrongs. Britain's High Commissioner to Kenya, Neil Wigan, told a local radio station last week that an apology would take his country into difficult legal territory. Acknowledgement alone is not enough, said David Nagasura, a historian from the Talai clan in Western Kenya, whose members were forced from their land in the 1930s and sent to detention camps. Today, much of that land belongs to multinational tea companies. I am yet to hear about compensation and reparations by the British government to the victims of historical injustices meted by the British colonial government. Kipchoge Arap Chomu, the great-grandson of King Koilatel Arap Samoei, who led a decade-long rebellion by the Nandi people before he was killed by a British colonel in 1905, said Charles's speech fell short of his hopes for an apology, reparations, and the return of his ancestors' remains. Charles just beat around the bush, went round saying, "We recognize the pain, we can't change the past," Chomu said. And that's exactly what it is. It's beating around the bush. It's saying bad things happened without actually acknowledging what that hurt was, what the effects of that hurt were, for something to be done to rectify the long-standing ramifications of this colonial past. Let's hear DW News' take on it.
King Charles has expressed regret for abuses during British colonial rule in East Africa, but the monarch stopped short of making a formal apology during a state visit to Kenya. The former British colony is celebrating 60 years of independence, and more recent events at a British Army training camp have not helped to improve relations.
This fire in the Loldaiga Hills in 2021 burned for days.
The fire destroyed approximately 12,000 acres of land.
The fire was started a few days ago by British troops carrying out training exercises in that part of the country.
That British involvement was clear to everyone.
So the cause of the fire was part of a British training exercise up there. So as you know, British and Kenyan forces regularly exercise up together in that area. It was an accidental fire that was started.
We're not talking decades and decades ago now. We're talking about 2021 with no apology from the British government for how that impacted the lives of local Kenyans. If Charles cares so much about the conservationist wildlife aspect of this, then obviously this is a crisis for the local wildlife. But even more than that, people were killed and hurt because of the actions of British soldiers carrying out these exercises.
Linus Morangeri worked at the British camp. He died while fighting the fire. His widow, Karen Gatweri, is struggling to raise their 2 sons alone. She says the children are getting no compensation for the loss of their father.
If it were not for the British soldiers' training, my husband would still be alive. Whenever I see them, I do not wish them well, since they are the cause of my suffering. I cannot stop my face from changing when I see them. I feel bad. It is still very painful.
Just absolutely heartbreaking. Heartbreaking that there are so many Kenyans out there that, due to the British government's actions, have lost a husband, a son, a wife, a daughter, a father, a mother. And the British government stays silent. What? Because they don't want to pay? Because they don't want to bust the myth that colonialism was a benevolent institution? They don't want to live with the actual reality of what Britain has caused throughout the world and want to live in ignorance? It's heartbreaking.
A consultancy report says Loldaiga will take until 2060 to recover. Kelvin Kubai represents people claiming compensation for the fire. He says they are at a similar disadvantage as the Mau Mau fighters, like his grandfather, who fought the British for independence.
We are fighting the same foe, and this same power, of course, tries in every way to resist its responsibility. Our grandfathers were fighting them with medieval weapons, some spears and clubs, and they had machine guns and planes then. They are fighting against an army that can afford the best lawyers in the country and tries to hide behind legal tussles and technicalities so as to evade responsibility.
Absolutely true. When Charles said that Kenya and the UK can come together on equal footing, he is refusing to acknowledge the power imbalances between these two countries, as this lawyer just stated. In both cases, Britain can avoid responsibility by being in a more powerful position on the world stage and having access and stronger ties to other nations. On top of that, the racist aspect of a predominantly white country going up against a predominantly black country on the world stage. And Charles refused to acknowledge that racism was a big export of the British Empire. Anti-black racism is still a huge part of this power imbalance between not only nations, but people.
King Charles III is technically head of that army. This week, during his visit to Kenya, he spoke about the atrocities against the Mau Mau fighters, but did not apologize. Far from the glamour of the state banquet, Karen is trying to focus on the future. Her message to the king:
I would just like to see my kids get help on how they can go to school, since their father had envisioned educating them all the way, and for them to lead a good life.
It again goes back to my comments that I made about how Charles's speech did not focus a lot on the Kenyan people and how to make their lives better. To see this young mother pleading with a king, the head of state, simply for access to education for her children, and to have none of that be part of Charles's speech is tragic. And to see apologists saying that this was a great speech and that Charles did everything that he could in this speech, because his hands are tied, he can't say anything that the British government wouldn't approve of, blah, 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 is not the case. Even if he didn't apologize, he could have centered a lot more of the conversation on the Kenyan people, and he didn't.
Let's bring in Felix Moringa, who filed that report. Felix, the fire at the Army training base is one source of grievance, but there have been many others. Tell us about them.
Some of the Mau Mau fighters still hold wounds that were inflicted on them back then, and they still haven't gotten any compensation. Lastly, people in the northern Kenya, where British soldiers also train, have many unreported cases of rape, destruction of property, and many other cases that they haven't reported. And the saddest bit of it all is that every time they try lodge a case in court, they're told these soldiers have immunity, so they cannot be tried in Kenya.
King Charles has admitted to colonial-era abuses when Britain tried to violently suppress Kenyan independence, but he didn't apologize. How was that received in the country?
So a group called Africa Rising had actually issued a statement immediately after King Charles' statement, and they said that regret and sorrow without a direct apology does not count for anything. Another Kenyan said that it was so sad that King Charles was in Kenya, on Kenyan soil, and has not apologized. A group of Mau Mau war veterans also said that they felt shortchanged by the fact that the king had not issued a direct apology to them.
Of course they would feel that way. We've seen time and time again different cases of horrible human rights abuses of the British government shirking their responsibility to seek justice. These words of deep sorrow and regret are not enough to actually heal any of these wounds. All right, time for the apologia. Let's go.
Joining us now is Royal Editor for the Daily Mirror, Russell Myers. Russell, the King has had his first major royal visit to a Commonwealth country. You were there. How did it go?
If I was to give the King sort of an evaluation of the trip, I think he did pretty well. And I think not only will he be very satisfied, the host will be satisfied as well as the British government.
So Russell Myers first notes that the British government would be pretty happy with this trip. I think that's absolutely true, but to say that the Kenyan government was happy with this trip or that the Kenyan people were happy with this trip is definitely not true and is ignoring all of the criticism that we have already seen. But why should we see it as a resounding success that the British government is happy that King Charles shirked all responsibility on behalf of the British government for all the atrocities committed in Kenya? Like that's bad.
People said to me before we went, why are you going to Kenya? Why aren't you going to one of the 14 British realms? It's a really interesting choice because it's a bastion of democracy.
This is something that I find odd about British neocolonialism, is that I think it tries to emulate American sort of foreign policy, in that American foreign policy is a lot of times about propping up democratic nations, praising democratic nations with this idea of wanting to spread democracy across the world. The UK seems to be trying to follow suit with that type of foreign policy, but the UK is not a democracy. And in fact, to go to one of their former colonies and praise it for its democracy when their own British citizens are not living in a democracy. I know British people will get mad at me for saying this, like, oh, well, we vote for our MPs or whatever. It's not a democracy, okay? Like that's the bare minimum. You vote for one person in the House of Commons. I would not say that the UK is a bastion of democracy in that sense. So I find it odd that that is the kind of foreign policy tactic that the UK wants to go with. Let's praise countries for their democracy when, one, that democracy was created to directly oppose British colonialism, and two, their own country is not a bastion of democracy.
It's got a long history with the United Kingdom, some of that good, some of that incredibly bad.
Just like totally ignoring all of these human rights violations, putting them all under the umbrella of very bad is kind of downplaying.
The King did touch upon in a major speech he gave at a state banquet. But I think, you know, when you're looking at the King Charles wants to have from the first few years of his reign, it's very, very much about looking forward, trying to atone of the sins of the past, certainly in terms of British colonialism, and when that went catastrophically wrong, as it did in the 1950s during the Mau Mau rebellion.
Oh my God, there's a lot to unpack. Firstly, British colonialism didn't go wrong in the 50s. It went wrong when British forces decided to create the colony of Kenya. Colonialism was always wrong. It was always a moral failing of the British government. So I'm not a fan of that phrasing. but also this idea of the British government, King Charles in this speech, wants to look forward. They don't want to look backward. And it's pretty easy when you are the aggressors in a situation to say that you want to look forward. You don't want to think about the past. You don't want to acknowledge the past harm. You don't want to do anything to set those wrongs right. You don't want to pay reparations. It's pretty easy for the aggressors in that situation to say that they want to look forward. But they only want to look forward because they don't actually want to do the work to fix these previous wrongs. It's just very rich coming from Britain to say that we should be looking forward, we should be moving forward, instead of actually getting justice for these people.
We need to stand up and apologise and be counted. And also looking forward.
He said we should stand up and apologise, but then didn't acknowledge that Charles did not apologize. It wasn't an apology.
Look like over the next... and also looking forward, what does King Charles's reign look at over the next few years? Well, it's all about relationships. It's all about trying to cement those, not only relationships for the British trade and British government, but also for the British royal family as well. And I think he did pretty well.
I think it's interesting Russell Myers doesn't actually understand how self-serving and selfish that sounds. It's all about what Britain can get out of Kenya. None of that is about what Kenya will get from Britain. Solidifying trade relationships between the UK and Kenya, solidifying a relationship between the royal family and Kenya. None of what Russell Myers said is about how Britain can support and help the Kenyan people, about making their economy better, about helping them to escape from the shadow of colonialism.
Now, look, you've alluded to King Charles addressing the wrongdoings of the past. Very heartfelt. And do you think the nature of this visit will set the tone for future royal visits, potentially to other former colonies?
I would not say any of that seemed heartfelt. What part of this was heartfelt? Something heartfelt would be an apology, but the speech that Charles gave was sidestepping an apology. So what part of it could be heartfelt when the speech itself is trying to dance around the elephant in the room so that the British government doesn't have to acknowledge their human rights violations?
Well, it's interesting because we have heard the King in recent years discuss his profound sorrow, certainly at issues like the transatlantic slave trade, which the British royal family did obviously have a hand in, and yet talking about atoning for the sins of the past. I mean, it didn't go as far as some critics wanted. They wanted a full apology, talk of reparations, which we've not only had in Africa, but indeed over in the Caribbean, certainly when William and Kate had their tour in 2022. However, I definitely do think that this will be a vein running forward in future tours. And how can it not be? Because certainly the King has said that it's part of his reign must be duly, the concept of it must be to try and right the wrongs of the past. And while we can't rewrite history, it's very, very interesting and very important, not only to him, but to the people that he's visiting, that he does tackle these subjects head on. And
it's as if British people know what they're supposed to say, but don't actually know the meaning of the words coming out of their mouth. To right the wrongs of colonial atrocities, you have to pay the consequences of those atrocities, either through reparations or through other programs to get justice, to get legal justice for the victims of these tragedies. So to say that this is going to be a through line through King Charles's reign, that he's going to right these historical atrocities because he's willing to say in public colonialism might have been bad, actually, it's not righting any wrongs. It is the bare minimum at this point in 2023. And yet Russell Myers wants us to give Charles this amazing credit for tackling head on the transatlantic slave trade, tackling, colonialism. But he's not actually tackling any of these issues. He is just the mouthpiece of the British government to shirk responsibility and to tell everybody, let's look forward now. Let's not think about all of these historical wrongs. Let's move on.
And I think he can only be applauded for that.
Yeah, I agree.
Next up, a clip from Lorraine.
But of course, we've got to talk about King Charles, who you may have seen that he gave this historic speech last night during his royal tour in Kenya, where he addressed the, this is a quote, unjustifiable acts of violence that were carried out by Britain's colonial rulers against Kenyans during the 1950s. It's our royal editor, Russell Myers, live from Kenya this morning, where, of course, the King and Queen, Russell, are continuing their state visit today. What did you make of it being there, hearing the King talk in language that we haven't really heard before in what is, you know, a really difficult situation, I suppose, because you've got to look back at history and put your hands up and say we got it very badly wrong?
But that's not actually what he said. These journalists are not actually saying what should be said, which is that the British government committed human rights abuses in Kenya. But he didn't actually put his hands up and say we got it very badly wrong. He used passive language to say bad things happened in Kenya. He didn't actually say we got it wrong, the British government got it wrong. He just said bad things have happened. It was all passively insinuated in his language, but at no point did he actually put blame or responsibility on anyone in the British government, any British people.
Yeah, you do. Good morning. In terms of the state banquet speech last night, you've just heard the pretty emotive, very punchy language used by King Charles, talking about the abhorrent nature of British colonial rule, no justification for the crimes, indeed talking about the Mau Mau uprising of the 1950s. And I think, you know, when I speak to people at the palace, they say, you know, Charles is very acutely aware that his reign must be to acknowledge the wrongs of the past. You know, we can't rewrite history, but it's about standing up and being counted and making sure he's doing the right thing moving forward.
He's doing the right thing for his image, maybe, but is he doing the right thing for the Kenyan people? for Kenyans, is he doing the right thing? Is the British government doing the right thing? That's the question. But instead, Russell Myers, yet again, is saying, well, we can't change the past, but Charles wants to acknowledge these wrongs. But that's only because it's a giant elephant in the room that he has to say bad things happened. But nothing is actually coming from that emotive language. No action is actually being taken. And what he's saying is not an apology. It is not a reckoning with the past. So it's just very frustrating that the British apologists want to pump up what Charles actually said and did to make it sound like it was more meaningful and more impactful for Kenyans than it actually was.
It's certainly been very well received here in Kenya.
Yeah, and he was described, wasn't he, by the president as being a veteran visionary, which I think is a huge compliment, isn't it, from another world leader to say, we see that you look with different eyes, perhaps, and you speak in a different way now.
Looking with different eyes and speaking in a different way is the bare minimum. It's the bare minimum of evolving as a society. But what are they actually doing? And the answer is nothing. And not only are they doing nothing, they are actively trying to choose language to avoid culpability, legally speaking.
And also, Russell, the fact that the UK has been compensating victims in Kenya, but it isn't really enough, is it? I don't think, for the Kenyans.
No, and I think, you know, you talk about sort of moving forward. There's definitely been calls for reparations. I mean, talking about billions, if not trillions of dollars around the world. Charles sees his role as very much not necessarily apologising for the wrongs, but acknowledging those wrongs. And the British government have already paid £20 million to ancestors of those local people who were affected by the Mau Mau uprising in the 50s.
Keep in mind, that was only to 5,000 victims. 5,000 victims. There are hundreds of thousands of victims from the Mau Mau revolution that have not been compensated, that have not had an apology or any acknowledgement of wrongdoing from the British government. Yes, £20 million might sound like a lot of money, but it was given to a very small number of people. And I think it's very frustrating when the hosts say, well, Kenyans don't seem to think it's enough. And the implication is basically, what do they want from us? We've already given them £20 million. What more could you ask for? And the answer is they could ask for a lot more because the 20 million pounds to 5,000 victims is not to scale with the level of atrocities committed in Kenya. It's not enough for all of those victims and all of the tragedy and heartbreak that they have had to endure.
But this is an issue. You know, we've already had it in the Caribbean when William and Kate were there a couple of years ago. This is the language that is being used, and certainly something that they have to tackle. And I think, you know, you have to give Charles credit because he's making sure that it's very, very much front and centre on the agenda. And I think that's pretty much stopping short of an apology, which is what some critics will want. He's playing his role quite well in that sense.
Yeah, and there may be some legal reason for not saying sorry itself, because that feels like a legally binding thing, and therefore it may precipitate lots and lots of legal claims, I suppose. But
well, yeah, that's, you hit the nail on the head, but the journalists don't actually want to tackle whether or not there is legal culpability on behalf of the British government. They just say, well, maybe they're not making an apology because that would make them legally culpable. Well, yeah. So why don't we reckon with that idea that the British government is trying to escape legal culpability? But they basically are just saying, well, yeah, it's only right for the British government to shirk all those responsibilities so that they're not legally liable. But they're not actually critiquing the government for doing that. Which seems like that should be the obvious next question. Why are we accepting that the government is trying to avoid legally binding statements that would ensure that they give reparations to these wronged parties? And last but not least, Talk TV. What have we got here?
And Sarah, we've got some live pictures, I think, on the way from the King and Queen's visit to Kenya. It's all about this apology. Undoubtedly, there were things in the past that were appalling.
Notice again the passive language. There were things that were appalling, not British soldiers, British government officials did appalling things to the Kenyan people, but these things happened. It's a passive sentence construction.
Well, not a political, but a tightrope for him to walk, right?
He says not political because they're trying to avoid claiming that King Charles has a political role, but this is absolutely a case of King Charles being put in a political role. This is a political decision for him to not apologize on behalf of the British government. And make no mistake about that. They want to avoid using the dreaded P word when they're talking about the king because they want to keep this myth that the king is not a political figure. But he is absolutely working in a political way with this state visit to Kenya.
It's exactly the word. Deepest sorrow, but not sorry. I think he went as far as he could without actually apologising. We heard him there talking about crimes of the past being abhorrent, being inexcusable, unjustifiable, no excuse for them, his deepest regret and sorrow. Even if he wanted personally to say sorry, the king can't because he's there and he makes that speech on behalf of the government, and all of those words will go through the government, and it's not government policy to apologise. Now back.
I think there's a lot there that's frustrating. One, there's this implication that King Charles wants to apologize, but his hands are tied by the British government. I don't think King Charles wants to apologize for colonialism. I don't think anybody in the royal family is that open-minded that they have fully reckoned with all of the historical wrongs of colonialism and not only want to apologize for them, but to rectify them. I don't think we're at that stage at all. I don't even think King Charles is like that understanding of like all the racial baggage. Putting all of this blame on the British government, well, he wants to say more, but he can't because he's there on behalf of the British government. And it's the British government, they don't want to apologize. The next obvious question is, why doesn't the British government want to apologize? Why is that not the policy to apologize and to rectify the wrongs of colonialism? Why is that? But it's just taken as a given. Of course the British government doesn't want to acknowledge colonialism. Why?
In 2013, there was a long legal case that led to compensation being paid out. And William Hague, then the Foreign Secretary, again expressed regret. That isn't far enough for many in Kenya. The Kenyan Human Rights Commission this week saying they didn't want these kind of mealy-mouthed statements. They wanted an unequivocal apology. They weren't going to get it, but I did think the language used by the King was as strong as it could be without taking that next step.
But this is a group of people who are fighting for their independence from a colonial rule. There were 1,000 people, just obviously needlessly, hanged back then. And we can't manage an apology. I know a lot of people say, oh, you start apologising for one thing, you've got to apologise for everything. But we're literally...
Yes. Yes, if you apologize to one colony, you should apologize to all the former colonies. Yes. But they're like, oh, it's a slippery slope. Britain might have to acknowledge a lot more atrocities that they've committed throughout the world. Yes. Yes, they should. Yes.
Actually talking about the word sorry.
Yes, but it's the word sorry then has greater legal implications and opens you up to calls for reparations, which isn't the government policy, which is why they've stopped short.
There's no questioning why doesn't the government want to pay reparations. It's just taken as a given that the British government is going to do the wrong thing.
Look, the King talked about wanting to deepen his understanding. Why this is really important that he gets this right is I think this sets a template for how the royal family deal with these questions throughout the Commonwealth and during those Commonwealth visits.
And it's really interesting because when he came to the throne, when he succeeded his late mother, he has talked, has he not, about a modern monarchy, a more open monarchy, a slimmed down monarchy, and I'm pretty sure that he would probably, I'm just surmising, tell me if I'm wrong, he probably would want to stand there and apologise. But
yeah, you're wrong. What part of anything that we've seen from the royal family demonstrates that they want to right the wrongs of colonialism? What part of what we've seen from the royal family makes us surmise that that's the case? Literally what part of it? The royal family literally chased out their only member of color because of racism. What part of how the royal family has navigated and handled their colonial legacy, what part of it makes it seem like King Charles wants to apologize for that? I feel like the reporters here want to put a more positive spin on what Charles has said and what the government has said in order to make Charles look better. But nothing about his actions demonstrate that he would want to give this apology, that he wants to understand like racism or whatever. The royal family has actively avoided getting DEI training. Like, nothing about their actions shows that they want to like learn more about racism and the legacy of colonialism. Literally nothing.
But it is a constitutional monarchy, and he is not in that position, and people have to remember that.
But that's still not answering why is the government making that decision. You see how it's just passing the buck off politically without actually trying to dissect, well, what's the right thing to do politically? What would actually be best in this situation?
I've been strangely surprised by him in the last 12 months.
By his candour, perhaps?
Yes, I imagined, people always talk, don't they, about Charles and the architecture's horrible and all that, whilst he waited for, the only way you're going to get the job you were born to is if and when your mother dies. I think he's shown a degree of real candour and maturity. I know that's a strange thing to say about a 75-year-old man. I think he's done a really good job, and I think it was difficult for him. I'm not condoning anything that happened. It's not his place.
These people are so close to actually touching on really pressing, interesting political questions, but then don't answer them. If it is not King Charles's place to apologize for colonialism, why is there a monarch in 2023 in the United Kingdom? If he serves no function, why are you giving him money? You are giving him money to go parrot the government's talking points, but then there's no criticism of what the government's policy is. It's so confusing to me. that we're getting so close to like serious political questions about the monarchy and its function and its role and whether a constitutional monarchy makes sense in the modern era. But then no one is actually delving into and answering those questions, because the answer would be that a monarchy makes no sense. The government should own their own policies and not hide behind King Charles. And King Charles should not be getting billions and billions of pounds of wealth to essentially parrot government conservative talking points on a world stage that actively harm other people.
What's interesting, though, about this, and we're talking about wrongs of the past. Actually, this isn't that far in the past,
No.
is it? We're talking about 1952 to 1960. His late mother had already come to the throne. Her portrait was hanging in some of those detention camps. So this is really uncomfortable territory for Britain and the royal family.
So uncomfortable that they refuse to acknowledge it at all.
They couldn't make the same mistakes that they made on the now Prince and Princess of Wales's tour of the Caribbean last year, when we had those throwback colonial images of them dressed in white in the open-top Land Rover. They want to learn, and I think that's what this visit is about.
What's the reception been like away from that? Obviously, that's been the feature in the media. What's the reception been like amongst the Kenyan
Pretty
people?
warm, a very warm welcome from President Ruto, although he had very strong words in his speech, and he was hinting at calls for further reparations for Kenya, but talking about that future relationship, and that's ultimately what this is about.
Focusing on the Kenyan government's response when this is a question of the Kenyan people's response is a very weaselly way to get out of answering the question. Of course, the government's response is going to be measured in a way that the Kenyan people's response, the people actually affected by these atrocities, is not. And the majority of Human Rights Watch in Kenya, people in Kenya, citizens of Kenya are reacting to this is not comparable to how the government is going to be nice and welcoming to King Charles, obviously. What, did they think that the Kenyan president was going to go up and pistol whip King Charles as soon as he walked off of the plane? Like, no, of course not. But it doesn't mean that Kenyans as a whole gave King Charles this nice, warm, welcoming reception. Oh my God, thank goodness we're done with that. That was so frustrating. Before we move on to the next topic, can we just savor this picture of King Charles nearly falling over? We're good. Next.
A rare move. The 57-year-old was made a peer in the House of Lords by King Charles, allowing for him to return to Parliament without being an elected MP.
If you take away literally anything from this channel, let it be this: the royal family is British politics. There is no separation between these tabloid fodder weirdos and the governance of the United Kingdom. No matter whatever British people want to say about it, King Charles is the head of state, and with that title comes political power and responsibilities. So let's talk about King Charles' recent governmental duties and how they fit into the British government's pathetic attempts to avoid complete and absolute omnishambles. Firstly, King Charles was required to give his first opening of Parliament speech.
Just before 11:15, the royal carriage drew into the sovereign's entrance, carrying, for the first time in 7 decades, a king to formally open Parliament. While the monarch had changed, the pageantry remained the same. As is tradition, Black Rod went to the Commons and had the door slammed shut against her by MPs. Before she summoned them to the Lords.
Now, Brits, I don't want to rain too much on your metaphorical parade here, but like, aren't you guys fucking tired of this? This stupid political theater? These kinds of traditions are cute when it's like your summer camp or your university, but not when we have a fucking government to run. the black rod banging on the door, the king giving a speech that he clearly didn't write because Rishi Sunak doesn't want to own the words of his own government. It's all just friggin' tiring when the majority of your country is poorer than fucking Mississippi. And for what was in the speech itself, I want to unpack the optics of Charles Windsor, the head of state whose pretty much entire fortune rests on the exploitation of people of color, pledging on behalf of one of the most openly racist governments in the UK that I've seen in my lifetime to keep communities safe from crime and illegal migration.
My government will act to keep communities safe from crime, antisocial behaviour, terrorism and illegal migration. A bill will be brought forward to ensure tougher sentences for the most serious offenders and increase the confidence of victims.
The dog whistle is barely a dog whistle. Apologists are obviously going to retort with, well, that's so unfair. These aren't Charles's own words. He just has to do what the government says. He can't help it if the government pledges to enact racist and xenophobic policies. My response to that would be twofold. Firstly, maybe unpack why in the hell in the year of our Lord 2023 we have this supposedly purely ceremonial figure parroting the government's talking points. Like, if it doesn't represent Charles Windsor and the government that is put on in his name, why have a monarch at all? For what purpose? And secondly, come the fuck on. Do you think that King Charles is just Ron Burgundy? You think he just literally reads whatever is on the teleprompter with no comment whatsoever?
You stay classy, San Diego. I'm Ron Burgundy?
Damn it! Who typed a question mark on the teleprompter?
If somehow Suella Braverman had gotten her grubby little hands on the paper and added some comments about Pakistani groomer gangs or whatever the hell is in her brain, don't you think Charles might give it a little pause? Maybe write a comment in the margins being like, I don't know if I should be saying this. I don't feel like this is a good look for me. Of course not. He absolutely would have been able to read this speech before he gave it, and even if he might concede to say certain points that he disagrees with, it does not mean that he would have no say in what would be presented. The old, it's purely ceremonial, he's just saying what the government wants him to say. Let's throw this excuse out the fucking window. Charles can take accountability for the words that come out of his mouth. And the words that did come out of his mouth were the conservative government's racist and xenophobic policies that we're gonna be looking back on in like 30 odd years being like, what the fuck was going on? We can't continue talking about British politics without talking about the big shakeup that's happened within the past week. Suella Braverman is out, David Cameron is in. And legally speaking, it couldn't have happened without King Charles.
Yeah, that is former British Prime Minister David Cameron making a shocking return to frontline politics in a major shakeup of the Conservative government. This comes as the current PM, Rishi Sunak, fired Home Secretary Suella Braverman after she made a number of divisive and controversial remarks. She's being replaced by James Cleverly, who had been Foreign Secretary. Cameron will now step into that role. David Cameron, who is no longer an elected official, will now enter the House of Lords.
So, what the hell happened? In October 2022, Rishi Sunak's administration rose to power after Liz Truss crashed the economy in a fiery, apocalyptic 49-day premiership. Sunak appointed Suella Braverman to be Home Secretary, despite her previously having been sacked under the previous administration. And right out the gate, Suella Braverman decided to go full mask off. Her first controversy was, right after being reappointed, to describe migrants to the United Kingdom as an invasion.
Let's be clear about what's really going on here, Madam Deputy Speaker. The British people deserve to know which party is serious about stopping the invasion on our southern coast and which party is not. Some 40,000 people have arrived on the south coast this year alone, many of them facilitated by criminal gangs, some of them actual members of criminal gangs. So let's stop pretending that they are all refugees in distress.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
She has also been a strong proponent of the UK's bizarre immigration policy known as the Rwanda Plan, in which the government planned to relocate asylum seekers to Rwanda rather than process those migrants into the UK.
Well, the system is rigged against the British people. It's as simple as that. That's why we're changing the laws through our illegal migration bill. That's why we are rolling out a groundbreaking partnership with Rwanda, which we believe is lawful, with a country that we believe is safe. So we need to change the system. We need to change our laws. That's how we're going to stop the boat.
Multiple times, Suella Braverman has blamed leftists for the Conservative government's bad policies not working. For example, in response to criticisms of the government's policies cracking down on public protest, she stated that demonstrators were, quote,
"It's the Labour Party, it's the Lib Dems, it's the Coalition of Chaos, it's the Guardian reading, tofu eating, wokerati, dare I say, the anti-growth coalition that we have to thank for the disruption that we are seeing on our roads today."
Side note, wokerati is a great rap name. She also tried to place blame on civil servants for the government's stupid and racist Stop the Boats campaign failing, claiming a, quote, activist blob of left-wing lawyers, civil servants, and the Labour Party was the reason that it failed. Not satisfied with stirring up shit against left-wingers who call her out on her authoritarian rhetoric, she's even been brazen enough to just outwardly claim that British Pakistani men were most likely to form, quote, groomer gangs in the UK.
What's clear is that what we've seen is a practice whereby vulnerable white English girls, sometimes in care, sometimes who are in challenging circumstances, being pursued and raped and drugged and harmed by gangs of British Pakistani men who've worked in child abuse rings or networks.
Which is obviously racist, but even more obviously racist when you look at, you know, facts, which shows that most child sexual exploitation crimes in the UK are committed by white men. Like, duh, obviously. She has even been publicly called out by a Holocaust survivor.
Now, when I hear you using words against refugees like swarms and an invasion, I am reminded of the language used to dehumanize and justify the murder of my family and millions others. Why do you find the need to use that kind of language?
Braverman, of course, doubled down and refused to apologize. She said, quote, "There is a huge problem that we have right now when it comes to illegal migration, the scale of which we have not known before. I won't apologize for the language that I have used to demonstrate the scale of the problem. I see my job as being honest with the British people and honest for the British people. I'm not going to shy away from difficult truths, nor am I going to conceal what is the reality that we are all watching." Oh my God. But strangely, none of this actually got Braverman fired from her job. No. It would take literal far-right nationalists in London to do that. See, in response to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict heating up in the last couple of weeks, which I am not gonna get into right now, okay? A group of demonstrators planned a peaceful pro-Palestinian protest on the weekend of Armistice Day in London. Before the event, the always tactful Suella Braverman, of course, decided to stoke tensions by claiming that the police were, quote, too lenient on these protesters, and claimed that they were, quote, hate marchers.
You call them hate marchers. Do you think everyone on these marches is hateful, as you put it?
I think, as I say, if you've seen images of hundreds of people chanting jihad, being corralled to do
everyone,
so,
even on the fringes of these marches,
flags,
is hateful.
Chanting from the river to the sea, which is a call to arms used by terrorists, celebrating the largest single loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust, glorifying acts of terrorism. I don't think there's any other way but to call them hate marches.
Then, after all of that fear-mongering, who were the ones that got violent on Armistice Day? That's right, right-wingers.
Why when it's us? Why when it's us?
Why when it's us, they asked the police. That might be a reference to comments earlier this week from the Home Secretary. She said right-wing protesters were rightly met with a stern response from the police, while what she described as pro-Palestinian mobs were largely ignored. After a few minutes, the group break through the police cordon and spill out onto Whitehall.
Ethno-nationalists and members of the English Defence League shouting, "England till I die." As with everything in the British media, the question immediately became, who is gonna get fired? And Braverman seemed like the obvious candidate. She had dog-whistled too close to the sun. So where does Charles Windsor fit into all of this? As the cabinet shakeup began, Suella was replaced by previous Foreign Secretary James Cleverly. But with that, who then was to replace Cleverly as Foreign Secretary? An absolutely shocking face emerged on Monday morning.
Former British Prime Minister David Cameron has been sensationally returned to office as the UK's new Foreign Secretary. Cameron resigned as Prime Minister back in 2016 over his failed Brexit stance, but has been asked to return as the UK's chief foreign diplomat.
Former Prime Minister and arguably the catalyst for the growing far-right populism in the United Kingdom, whose premiership signaled the beginning of the end, David Pigfucker Cameron. But how could this be? David Cameron is no longer an MP. He's not been in the government since he slithered away in 2016. See? There's a bit of a loophole there. And King Charles was the linchpin to the plan.
Here in the UK, you might think that we live in a democracy because, after all, we have elections and we get to vote. But that's only one side of the story. In fact, over there in the Houses of Parliament, the majority of politicians have not actually been elected. What's going on? When people talk about the UK's Houses of Parliament, they're normally talking about the House of Commons. That's where the Prime Minister goes every week to answer questions from other political parties. But Parliament actually has two chambers. The other one is the House of Lords, and that's where the Earl of Selborne is. Members of the House of Lords are often known as peers, and there's almost 800 of them in total.
But Catella, if King Charles had not granted this peerage, wouldn't he be subverting the will of the people? Literally, what part of this is the will of the people? Sunak was not elected by the British public. King Charles was not elected by the British public. David Cameron was not elected by the British public. None of these people have a democratic mandate. On the contrary, Charles could argue that refusing to grant this peerage would have sent a signal to the government to look for someone who was, actually elected by a constituency. In this way, the whole "the king only has a ceremonial role" song and dance is just a cover for the fact that King Charles can, on the advice of the government, choose to grant a life peerage in his role as head of state to a previously failed prime minister. Something that is kind of shocking for a lot of British people right now who didn't really think of this being a possibility.
Charles III, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of other realms and territories king, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith, to all lords spiritual and temporal, and all other our subjects whatsoever to whom these presents shall come, greeting. Know ye that we of our especial grace, certain knowledge and mere motion, in pursuance of the Life Peerages Act 1958, and of all other powers in that behalf us enabling, do by these presents advance, create and prefer our right trusty and well-beloved counsellor, David William Donald Cameron, to the state, degree, style, dignity, title and honour of Baron Cameron of Chipping Norton in our county of Oxfordshire.
And if you think about the implications of Charles being able to do this, even if it's at the request of the current Prime Minister, it's frankly still pretty terrifying. Listen, Charles doesn't want to go sit in Parliament and talk about anti-smoking campaigns, or wake up in the middle of the night to do some fucking magical ceremony with David Cameron. He just wants to luxuriate with his billions of dollars. Why not advocate for a constitution which cuts him and his family out of the government entirely so he can do just that? And while we're at it, why not remove the entire concept of life peerages, which are antithetical to any definition of democracy? My main hope is with the new reign of King Charles, we can begin to critically examine these political processes in a way that doesn't just pass the buck off to ceremonial duties or the PM made me do it, but engages with the fact that the current way that British politics works is through King Charles, an all-in-all shitty person who doesn't actually want to, and in some cases cannot, make governmental decisions. And yet in his duties as head of state, he is being funded by taxpayers to actively make their lives worse, to appoint life peerages to failed conservative leaders, to read out disgusting and stupid policies from the conservative government who have literally failed upwards. None of these people have been elected. If King Charles is not a leader, why treat him as one? Why give him the funds? And why keep the system as it is rather than adopt a real constitution, a real democratically elected head of state and parliament, and real branches of government with checks and balances? Listen, I'm not saying the US is perfect, but we figured this shit out 250 years ago. Maybe it's time for the UK to figure this shit out too. Go out and protest before your government literally outlaws all forms of public assembly and establishes lèse majesté once again. We're done. Thank you so much for listening to all of my ramblings. Hopefully I'll be back with more content soon. Let me know if I should watch The Crown. I'm kind of looking forward to Omid Scobie's Endgame. I think that would be really fun to do some commentary on. I've had some other scripts in the work talking about the BBC, child stardom, a whole bunch of other sort of royal adjacent topics. Let me know what you want me to do with this kind of like shorter form content sort of stuff. Press all the buttons, click subscribe, write a comment, click like, click dislike, I don't give a fuck. Tell me I'm just a hater, I don't care. Fight with me in the comments. All right, bye-bye. Hey, Teddy. Teddy.